Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about Monster. The movie Monster is based on the book of the same name and tells the story of a black teenager named Steve Harmon who's an honor student at high school, and he plans to enroll in film school after he graduates, but then he ends up getting arrested for a murder that he didn't commit. He's arrested along with 3 other black kids who are involved at the scene of the crime in one form or another, although in this case Steve is the main character of the story. So the main theme that's driving behind the story is basically how black youth continue to struggle with the American justice system as it exists today, despite years, even decades of having struggled with it previously, and you'd think that there'd be some sort of innovation involved and that there'd be less racism in the world, but as we know today, that's not the case. I don't think this movie will win any points for being original. It's pretty much just your average bog standard courtroom drama, albeit with some racial themes behind it, and even then it's not the first of its kind, but for what it was, I thought the performances of the actors were really well done. Kelvin Harrison Jr. plays the lead role of Steve in this movie, and I thought he did a fantastic job showcasing his character's struggles from beginning to end. You can tell that Steve is a guy that has a lot of promise behind him and has a bright future ahead of him, but he just happens to be caught up with the wrong people at the wrong place at the wrong time. I think some of the best scenes in this movie are when Steve is behind bars and he has to come to terms with the reality that's been placed in front of him. The movie does a great job showing just how scared Steve is dealing with his new circumstances and how he has to be surrounded with all these criminals that have committed way more sinister actions than he ever would. I also liked how the movie showed Steve had a big support network behind him, though it mostly comes in the form of his 2 parents, who are played by Jennifer Hudson and Jeffrey Wright, and I was actually really surprised to see them in this movie. I like the fact that this movie shows Steve has a positive relationship with his parents right from the get-go. Too often in these kinds of movies, the character, especially if he or she happens to be black or a visible minority, either have a negative or dysfunctional relationship with their family members, or they don't have any at all. In this movie, however, not only do the parents have a great relationship with Steve, but they also have little characteristics that make them stand out a bit from the other characters. The mother is religious, and she brings the Bible a couple times when she goes to see Steve at the visiting room in the jail, and they read verses together so that they can maintain his morale, while the father, I believe, was a graphic designer of sorts, and there's a couple times in the movie where it shows him interacting with his work, and you can just see the impact that he has on Steve in terms of his artistic pursuits. There's a couple other characters in this movie that stand out to me, although not as much as the other 3. A$AP Rocky plays James King, who's part of the bad crowd that Steve ends up getting mixed up with, and he's the one that actually commits the murder at the convenience store where it happens. There wasn't really much to James King's character. He just came off as your average bad boy gangster that didn't really have anything going on in his life other than the life of crime that he was inevitably going to live. While I thought the acting performances of this movie were great for the most part, I thought that the movie itself was a little on the nose as far as its commentary on racism was concerned. One of the scenes that stood out to me the most in this regard is when Steve is arrested at his home by the most cliche-looking detective that I ever seen. He straight up looks like one of the Men in Black from the movie. He comes in a black fedora, black blazer, black everything except for his white shirt underneath, and he just has this really rotten attitude about him. He claims that he just wants to ask Steve a couple questions about the crime that had taken place at the convenience store, and when Steve goes down to talk to him, he ends up arresting Steve on the spot without asking him any questions whatsoever. I hated that scene. It just felt so unrealistic the way everything happened so suddenly. I mean, who knows, maybe it does happen in real life like that, but I feel like it doesn't happen the way that it does in this movie. I also found myself being really annoyed with the snobby lawyer in the courtroom scenes who's accusing Steve and James and all the other characters of being nothing more than monsters. I understand the reasoning behind why the lawyer called all of those characters monsters, because they're all being accused of having committed a monstrous crime, and the movie itself also happens to be based on a book also called Monster, but again, I just felt that anything that happened with him on screen was so unrealistic. He was just so hammy and corny. And it's not just the white characters that have this annoying treatment behind them. There's also a jailmate of sorts that Steve is associated with behind bars who has a philosophical discussion with him towards the end of the movie and how he's basically responsible for creating his own form of justice, and that made no sense to me whatsoever. The idea behind it is that the American justice system isn't necessarily black or white, it's gray and has various shades in between. But it also makes it a point to bring up that that same system is also rigged against certain members of society, specifically those who are visible minorities, even more so if you happen to be black. And I get that his jailmate was trying to inspire Steve to follow his truth and stand up against the system no matter what it said about him, but I couldn't help that it was encouraging a defeatist mentality that would continue to encourage that kind of criminal behavior going forward, even despite the fact that Steve wasn't responsible for it from the get-go. Despite being annoyed by a few scenes and characters like what I just mentioned though, I have to say that this movie has a lot more artistic merit going for it compared to other courtroom dramas. One of my favorite things about this movie and its commentary on racism is how it shows Steve filming everything in his environment and he's taking pictures all the time, and all those videos and pictures happen to be in black and white. I like how Steve chose to show all those pictures and videos in black and white, because it goes to show that no matter what your skin color is, ultimately everyone is the same. And you could also take a more moralistic perspective with the whole black and white theme, in that everyone lives their lives with shades of gray, and like I said earlier, the American justice system isn't necessarily black or white. Sometimes Steve goes a little bit overboard with how much he uses his camera though. I found that there were a lot of close-up shots in this movie, up front in people's faces, that just didn't have any point being there in the movie. I also thought the movie was really weird with how it handled its transitions. In one scene, they might be in the middle of a flashback where Steve is in happier times, and then the next, without warning, it'll transition to the middle of a courtroom scene. Sometimes these transitions will be preceded by a film grain that's supposed to be connected to Steve's camera somehow, but I don't know how that'd be the case. I mean, it's not like he's filming with a VCR setup. Overall, Monster is little more than your average courtroom drama. It is a little step above in terms of how it addresses the American justice system and its effects on racial minorities, but not that much more. If you have a craving for a courtroom drama or a movie that promotes black rights, or ideally in this case both, then I think you might get some enjoyment out of this movie. I thought the acting in this movie was great, and some of its commentary on racism was good as well, but ultimately it just doesn't really stand out of the crowd for me. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of Monster. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the Indian drama, Milestone. Bye bye!